All right. Well, thanks for coming. For my students, I apologize that you have to endure another hour of this, but for everybody else, thanks for giving up your Saturday morning. I'm excited to present something that I feel is important for us to understand a little bit more about, and something that is kind of near and dear to my heart a little bit in terms of the restoration. And so I want to share with you a little bit about Orson Hyde and why early Mormons were so interested in Jews and Judaism. And this is a very important weekend for us to gather and talk about such a subject, because it was just this week that Elder Cook and Elder Holland met with Jewish delegates, including Senator Joseph Lieberman, in Jerusalem, and celebrated the 175th anniversary on Thursday, October 24th, of Orson Hyde's dedicatory prayer there in Jerusalem. So this is I think at least a fitting topic. I have yet to convince anybody else that's true, so maybe by the end I can do that. Where I want to start today is thinking about what does the Book of Mormon say, because this is, of course, one of the guiding texts for early Mormons, and prompts them to start being interested in what's going on with Jews historically, but in Orson Hyde's case at least, what's happening with Jews here and now in the 1830s and 1840s. So one of the central themes of the Book of Mormon is the role that Jews have historically played in God's work, and the central place they will assume in the latter days. Within the opening chapters of the Book of Mormon, Nephi makes it quite clear that the need for his family to understand and acknowledge God's interaction with their ancestors through the record of the Jews and the genealogy of their forefathers. The stated purpose for Nephi and his brothers' return to Jerusalem was to procure the record, so that they might, quote, preserve unto their language the language of their fathers, as well as the words which have been spoken by the mouth of all the holy prophets. And so it's from the very beginning of Nephi's record, and later on in the Book of Mormon, that these individuals, known as Jews, are figuring prominently in the mind of Joseph Smith and these early Mormons. And what I want to show, however, is that in addition to the Book of Mormon, there were other things going on for Joseph Smith and for Orson Hyde and others that prompted them to think not just about what was happening long term with Jews being God's covenanted people from ancient times, but also what were they supposed to be doing with Jews in the 1830s and 40s. And this is a critical, I think, an important aspect for us to get a glimpse of, is to step back and say, what are Hyde and Smith reading that's leading them to be interested in this? Because it's not just a mention in the Book of Mormon, but there are many other things, political events, social events, economic events that are prompting these early Mormons to be interested in Jews who are not just an ancient religion, but actually a living religion that they are witnessing, especially when the apostles go to England. I want to look at just 4 places here where I think there's an impetus for the Book of Mormon aspect of this argument. First of all, the authors of the Book of Mormon were remarkably aware of their own internal purposes and the larger divine narrative of the text they produced. Nephi, one of the first prophetic figures encountered in the book, argued, quote, I, Nephi, received a commandment that the ministry and the prophecies, the more plain and precious parts of them, should be written upon the plates, and that the things which were written should be kept for the instruction of my people, who shall possess the land, and also for other wise purposes, which purposes are known unto the Lord. And it's there that I want to kind of focus the later part of my presentation, think about what are those other wise purposes. As well, we have to notice in 1 Nephi the mention of this eventual moment when the covenant people Israel will be gathered along with every nation, kindred, and people. The Book of Mormon frames a long narrative of God acting in the world, and also infused early Mormonism with a sense of both responsibility and longing for the millennium, when God will commence a full gathering of Israel. As the title page of the Book of Mormon makes quite clear, that this was a book that was written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel, and also to the Jew and Gentile, and is to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel the great things the Lord hath done for their fathers. and that they might know the covenants of the Lord, that they are not cast off forever. And this is going to be what, for Orson Hyde, is going to be a very central role in his mind, is to help Jews understand where they fit. Help remind them of the covenants that God made with their people and bring them back into the broader fold of the children of God. As part of this, early members of the church firmly believed that there would be a moment when Jews would be invited back to or would gather again in Jerusalem. And this is part of what Hyde is most interested in. Using the historian's lens here, I think it's helpful for us to put Hyde in his context, to place him, especially when he gets to England, in a world that is where he is reading newspapers, where he is influenced by discussions he's having with people on the streets, and also influenced by discussions he's having with, as he called them, principal Jews, meaning often the rabbis and community leaders. And from there he draws both a parallel to the Book of Mormon narrative that there would be a time when Jews would be gathered again, but also provides for him the impetus for doing something. And it's that aspect of doing something that is most interesting to me, because it moves Hyde into a world of almost activism, of kind of political engagement in a way that I don't think we fully explored in Mormon history yet. Now, it's interesting, of course, that Hyde is in Britain, 1837-38, and then also later on in 1840. And it's there that he is in this process of engaging with a community of many, many Jews, much more than he would encounter, of course, in Kirtland and elsewhere. He's in the cities of London, he's in Liverpool, Preston, and it's there that we also find the correlation of Britain's largest communities of Jews anywhere in the empire. Now, we have to keep in mind that the prophetic call of the 12 in 1837-38 is important, both because it opens up, as the Doctrine and Covenants calls it, an effectual door for the expansion of missionary efforts that would eventually bring about a strong cohort of future church leaders and provide essential converts en masse. And an added benefit of this, however, is that it places these Mormon apostles, particularly Hyde, in a hotbed of Jewish discussions about gathering to Palestine and creating a space for Jews in which they could live peaceably among themselves. As they're doing this, they're taking with them, of course, the book, the record, the Book of Mormon, and they're using it in their missionary efforts. Richard Bushman has called this, he says, records are the primary instrument of restoration. Hence, the Book of Mormon's mission to inform Israel of the covenant of the Lord and to convince the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ. Now, in that process, right, as they're taking a record that mentions these people specifically, they can draw upon both a communal identity among Jews to say, we are talking about you, but also then assert the very Mormon notion that we too are adopted spiritual Israel, and therefore we have some kind of common cause, some kind of common nature, and indeed a common covenant. Now, when they arrive in Britain, the world of Britain in 1838-39 is in an uproar for a number of reasons, which I'll kind of highlight here as we go. But among the Christians in Britain, they are deeply interested in Jews and this potential or future regathering of Jews to Palestine. As you can see from this dapper Dan here, Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, here's what he wrote in 1839 in the Quarterly Review. He argued for a greater sense of Christian appreciation for Jews as, quote, the remnant of a people who produced poets like Isaiah and Joel, kings like David and Josiah, and ministers like Joseph, Daniel, and Nehemiah, but above all, as the chosen race of men of whom the Savior of the world came according to the flesh. Now, this is very different than many Christian notions of Jews in the 19th century, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it highlights Jewish contributions to the world of, we'll call it literature, biblical literature, philosophy, but he also then attributes to them Jesus Christ. And this is a major shift. During the Middle Ages and during the early modern period in Europe, Jesus Christ was never fully equated as being Jewish. Rather, he was seen as being the one who supplanted Judaism, who suppressed Judaism, who overcame Judaism to bring about a new message. And here we have Lord Ashley here reasserting that notion that Jesus, the Christ, is also Jesus, the Jew. And this is something that Mormons are deeply interested in, and Orson Hyde is going to reflect many of that same sentiment. Mormon theology maintains that the spiritual blessings made to Abraham and his posterity continue even up to this day, and it will be essential to an eventual gathering of God's children. That's Doctrine and Covenants 27. In its theology, if not fully within its practice then, early Mormonism rejected traditional Christian supersessionism. And supersessionism is the notion that Christianity, right, the advent of Christianity through Jesus Christ, replaces the Old Covenant, moves it out of the realm of God's purview in a sense. Right? What it says is Jews once held the covenant, but because of disobedience have lost their place within that covenant, and Christianity has fully supplanted it. Now, of course, we can understand something of that from the Restoration message, but we also have to recognize that for these early Mormons, and indeed for the church today, as we can see in some of the things that Elder Hall and Quentin L. Cook said while they were in Jerusalem this week, we understand Jews today to be part of God's covenanted people. They haven't lost that covenant. And so, from the very beginning, Mormonism is a little bit different, but it's not the only one that's doing this. As Mormonism perpetuates this idea that Jesus is both Jew and Christian, obviously in a Mormon understanding, they began to argue for the necessity of gathering, both for themselves, as we can see when they show up in Kirtland, Missouri, Illinois, but also a parallel gathering that's going to happen among the Jews. And that parallel gathering in 1840 is the central focus of the Jewish world. Jews are beginning to look forward to this moment. They're starting to experiment with the possibility of sending Ashkenazi Jews, these are Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, to Palestine to establish small settlements that may serve as the beginning point of that gathering process. So it's not just Mormons that are interested in this process, but indeed the whole political world, especially Britain, is focused on that aspect in 1838, 39, and 40. As well, Joseph and Hyde and others hired a Hebrew instructor to come and share with them the language skills they would need in order to translate the Bible, to work with it, and to use this ancient text. This is an important step because, as you can see here, in a letter that Satius writes regarding Joseph Smith, it basically gives him a certificate that says he has attended these classes with me and has come to the ability to be able to sufficiently to translate the text, to work with the text, to understand Hebrew. Hyde would communicate back and forth with Satius at the end of Satius's term as their teacher, and thank him for the incredible work he has done to open up new avenues for Mormons to start thinking about the Book of Mormon, gathering, and the Bible. Alexander Campbell, of course, is one of these very interesting figures in early American religious history. He is a restorationist, and he is arguing something similar to what we would identify with today, probably within Mormonism, that, as he argued, Christians ought to know something of Adam, Abel, Noah, Melchizedek, Isaac, Jacob, on down the line, and also of ordinances, the Passover, the scapegoat, the red heifer, the year jubilee, the law of the leper, the kinsman redeemer, the cities of refuge, together with all the sacrifices, washings, anointings, and consecrations of the holy language, of the holy nation. And here he is not talking about America. He's talking about the Jewish nation, is what they call it. There's a reason that Christians need to know about this stuff. And for Hyde, as for Campbell, getting at the heart of what Jews believe opens up for us a better and deeper understanding of the covenant. Now, Orson Hyde's journey to Europe and Jerusalem is the subject of numerous accounts within early Mormon missionary efforts and travels abroad. He was supposed to join Johnny Page on this mission. Johnny Page doesn't make it. He actually never gets on the boat. But before embarking toward England in 1840, Hyde wrote to Joseph Smith, and he said that the missionaries ought to, quote, spread among all people, languages, and tongues as far as possible, and gather up all jewels among the Jews besides. And then in response, in a letter dated from 14th of May, 1840, Joseph Smith responded to Hyde and to Page, and he said this, quote, if there is anything calculated to interest the mind of the saints, to awaken in them the finest sensibilities, surely it is the greatest and it is the great and precious promises made by our Heavenly Fathers to the children of Abraham. Brethren, you are on the pathway to eternal fame and immortal glory. And inasmuch as you feel interested for the covenant people of the Lord, the God of their fathers shall bless you. Do not be discouraged on account of the greatness of this work. He who scattered Israel has promised to gather them, therefore, inasmuch as you are instrumental in this great work, he will endow you with power, wisdom, might, and intelligence, and every qualification necessary. And so you can see that even for Joseph Smith, this is something that is deeply connected to his understanding of the Book of Mormon, and that history that it talks about, but also the future that it prophesies about. The echoing of the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants claims about the children of Abraham, combined with their prophetic call to gather scattered Israel, made Orson Hyde long to see the cities he once saw in vision and fulfill his mission to the people God had long prepared. The idea that Christianity functioned allegorically to fulfill Old Testament prophecies about Israel was firmly fixed in 19th century Christian parlance. This rhetoric, coupled with the Book of Mormon text, led Hyde and other early Mormons to consider the possibility that there might be a literal gathering. Wilford Woodruff, of the 12 apostles, one of the 12 apostles of Britain, wrote in his journal this. He said, quote, I addressed in the forepart of the day, had the chills and fever in the afternoon, but met with the saints in the evening and broke bread unto them. Right? These are kind of how some of these early journals read. They're fairly benign and boring. But then he adds this. My mind is much interested these days in the gathering of Jews, for they are now fast fulfilling the scriptures by returning to Jerusalem. Further, he noted on the 2nd of November, 1840, that there were efforts by an individual named Moses Montefiore, and Montefiore is one of the very important British Jewish communal leaders who is known for his philanthropy, and he is working toward helping Jews in Jerusalem overcome some of the issues that are facing them, but also thinking about how do we develop avenues for and mechanisms to help Jews migrate. And so it's interesting that Woodruff is talking about what Jewish leaders are doing. Sometimes we skip over that aspect of that experience as these early missionaries are in Britain. And I think it's a little bit telling to see why that is so firmly fixed there for him and for Hyde and others. What we learn then is that they were reading the newspapers. They were having street conversations. They were learning not just about British Christians, but British Jews, and placing that in the context of the major streams of movement and political decisions that are happening at the time as they're sitting there watching these things happen. They couldn't have done this from Kirtland. The 12 had to be in Britain in order to get this perspective. They couldn't sit. There is no kind of evidence in sort of the papers they would have read in the United States at the time that would have mentioned as extensively the things that they're getting while they're in Britain and arguing and seeing this happen. Now, it's interesting then that as in 1841, April, as Hyde's preparing to make his journey from Britain on to Palestine and to Jerusalem, that he meets with the 12. Woodruff noted that after Hyde made his way to Manchester to meet with other members of the 12 in April 1841, he, quote, appealed powerfully to the meeting and covenanted with the saints present in a bond of mutual prayer during his mission to Jerusalem and to the east, which was sustained on the part of the hearers with a hearty amen. And the following day, Woodruff noted that Before we left, the 12 laid hands upon the head of Elder Orson Hyde and blessed him in the name of the Lord, as he had been set apart by the first presidency to take a mission to the Holy Land, the city of Jerusalem where Jesus dwelt, for the purpose of laying the foundation of a great work in that land. This is the first mission that any man has taken to the land of Asia, belonging to the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints. Much of the Spirit of God rested upon us when we blessed him. Elder Kimball was mouth and Elder Taylor scribe. It's interesting as you sit and read some of these accounts to notice that what's happening is they are making these connections very clearly in their minds that we have a restoration on the American continent. We are now here in Europe. We're seeing things happen among the people. Right? Whether it was making the connection between Montefiore and the desire to go to Palestine for Jews, and then connecting that to how can Mormons help as a catalyst in this process of gathering. And then connecting it all back to this is the place where Jesus dwelt. I find that fascinating. Now, as was his habit of doing, Hyde shows up in these European cities, particularly in England, and he seeks introduction with some of the principal Jews of the place, he said. One of these Jews is the aged chief rabbi. You can see him up here on the screen. This is Solomon Herschel. Herschel is at the end of his life when Hyde is trying to meet with him. And Hyde will write letters to him. It's unclear, as best I can tell, whether he actually meets with him, but we know they have some communication back and forth. Herschel is laid up due to a leg injury at the time, and so he was accepting more visitors than he normally had been. But Hyde writes back to the States and to Joseph in the First Presidency and shares with them some of his letters that he's writing to Herschel and others. Herschel was part of a growing reform movement. And as a result of Hyde's discussions with individuals like Herschel, one of the things he's getting is a sense of what can Mormons do now. So in an 1842 letter to Parley P. Pratt, who was in Liverpool at the time, Hyde wrote, quote, "There's an increasing anxiety in Europe for the restoration of that people, and this anxiety is not confined to the pale of any religious community, but it has found its way to the courts of kings. Special ambassadors have been sent, and consuls and consular agents have been appointed. The rigorous policy which has hitherto characterized the course of other nations towards them begins to be softened by the oil of friendship and modified by the balm of humanity." End quote. It's important for us to understand what that letter is really saying. For a very long time, Jews had been kicked out. So 1492, they're kicked out of Spain, and they're kicked out of other countries as well in Europe. But by the 19th century, things have started to change. So after the French Revolution and Napoleon extends an offer to French Jewish communities and says, as long as you can abide by a certain set of regulations and laws, I will allow you to be full citizens of the French nation, the French Republic. And because of that, then, other countries start thinking about what are we doing with our Jewish populations. It's interesting that in the world that I study, Russia, Jews never have it easy there, and this never goes very well. But it's in 1840 that the government starts thinking about a different way to encounter their Jewish communities. So what they do is they start educating young Jewish boys and taking them and sending them off to German universities so that they can become contributing members of society in terms of secular occupations. And there's a very, very short window that's happening, and that's between about 1832 and 1850. After that, there's restrictions that come back in, and they restrict Jewish access to education and things like that. So this is a very unique window in European history. And it's interesting that the Quorum of the 12 are there on their missions, and they are encountering Europe at this time. And so it makes a little bit of sense why they're so interested in this moment, or this movement to get Jews back to Palestine. Moses Hess, the German Jewish writer, acknowledged that the year 5600, which is 1840, okay, the Jewish year 5600 as a messianic year. And what he meant by that was, in the Zohar, which is a 13th century Jewish mystical text, there's a comment about the year 5600 as a moment in which reflects a flood. What he means by that is they connect it back to Noah and the flood of Noah of water. In 1840, they talked about there being a flood of wisdom and knowledge. So what it says is in the Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin, it says, Rabbi Eliezer says the days of the Messiah will be 40 years. But Rabbi Dosa, the way the Talmud works is you usually have one rabbi asserting one thing, another rabbi asserting something else, and they argue it out over pages and sometimes chapters, and then they come back to a conclusion sometimes, not always. My students have had to read some of Talmud and they get a little frustrated with it. But what you see here is Rabbi Dosa, who's the arguing against Rabbi Eliezer, says, quote, 400 years, not 40 years, but 400 years, hence it is written, and they shall serve them and shall afflict them 400 years, and elsewhere make us glad according to the days wherein you are afflicted. The Zohar changes this just a little bit to say that in this flood of knowledge and wisdom, unlike the flood of water at the time of Noah, will occur around the year 5600. What this does is, if you allow for that 400-year period, Jews in Europe, and this is Moses Hess, who was one of the kind of very important secular Jews, right? He's not a necessarily deeply religious Jew, but he's reading this text and saying, if there's going to be a time when we get to the end of the world, right, 6,000 years for traditional Jews, 5,600 leaves 400 years on, and that's how they're reading this back into it. Now, that seems a little bit bizarre to some of us, but the fact that it's happening in mainstream publications, mainstream newspapers, and it's being talked about quite heavily among Jews is interesting to kind of make that connection a little bit. Now, there's been work on that aspect of Jewish history, and what they've discovered is this discussion about 1840 as a critical messianic year opens up an entire public debate, public discussion about what will happen and what it will mean. For the apostles, I have to think as they're sitting there looking at this and they're hearing about it, because Woodruff echoes some of this commentary in his own journal, where he says, 1840, something's happening here, right? There's something remarkable going on in the world. God is opening up new avenues for us we've never seen before. And so they're reflecting some of that very same sentiment, but as it's happening, you have to sit back and go, is God working outside of these apostles? And that's one of the things that I've come to in the conclusion of this paper, is that God has worked through many different people. He's bringing about his work. He's bringing about his purposes, right? Those wise purposes that the Book of Mormon was talking about. But he's doing it in a way that sometimes we like to claim a lot of the glory and say, yes, through our group that we get the restoration. We have to recognize that maybe God was working in Europe in a very different way, but it was overlapping and connected to what these apostles are looking at. Now, Hyde goes on towards Jerusalem. Hyde ports in Beirut for a few short days, which is a central destination of European Jewish migration in the 1830s. And so there he's kind of caught up again in some of this fervor about we're going back to our homeland. We're, this next year in Jerusalem type sentiment. We're actually making it happen. And he writes about these Christian clergy members who he's meeting while he's on this journey. And he writes, and he says, the course which the popular clergy pursue at this time in relation to the divine economy looks to me as though they would say, O Lord, we will worship thee with all our hearts, serve thee with all our souls, and are and be very pious and holy. We will even gather Israel, convert the heathen, and bring in the millennium. If you will only let us alone, that we may do it in our own way, and according to our own will. But if you, right, remember he's talking about God here, right? This is what the clergy are saying. But if you speak from heaven to interfere with our plans, or cause any to see visions, or dream dreams, or prophesy, okay, think about what Hyde knows, right? Whereby we are disturbed and interrupted in our worship, we will exert all our strength and skill to deny what you say and charge it home upon the devil or some wild, fantastic spirit as being its author. Right? That's Hyde's perception of the way that Christians are encountering this move among Jews to go back to Palestine. Hyde, however, has a different plan. January 1st, 1842, so on his return trip, he says this. He says, quote, it was by political power and influence that the Jewish nation was broken down and her subjects dispersed abroad. And I will here hazard the opinion that by political power and influence they will be gathered and built up, and further that England is destined, in the wisdom and economy of heaven, to stretch forth the arm of political power and advance in the front ranks of this glorious enterprise. This opinion I submit, however, to your superior wisdom, to correct, if you shall find it wrong. Right? What Hyde's saying is, there are things happening in this gathering, and it's not that God isn't working the process, but God is working through politicians, through philanthropists, through leading communal Jewish leaders, to try and get people back to Palestine. So Hyde's recognizing that part of this gathering that God has promised is happening through individuals. It's not happening by some grand scheme of appearances and visions and all these things. He's simply saying, it's happening on the ground. We ought to be a part of that. Now, being in Beirut, Hyde has another very important experience. Beirut is near Damascus, and in Damascus in 1840, in February of that year, we have an Italian monk named Father Thomas, who along with his servant disappeared in Damascus. The charge of ritual murder was levied against the city's Jewish population, and they were convicted. Ritual murder consists of a charge against Jews that they have captured a Jewish child, drained the blood from the Jewish child, murdered the child, obviously, and then hidden the body. And this charge is levied, particularly in the 19th century, quite extensively. But 1840 is the one case, as Jonathan Frankel has shown, that 1840 is the case when ritual murder becomes international news. Jews in England, Moses Montefiore, for example, Herschel, also Adolf Cremot, who you can see here on your right-hand side. These are the most important figures in the Jewish world at the time, and they are riding to Damascus, they're riding to Beirut, they're traveling to Damascus, and they are pleading with the government there to acquit the Jewish community. This never happened, right? This murder never happened, at least not as a ritual murder. And so they are trying to get things calmed down, because what happens in the 19th century around ritual murder trials is when Jews are accused in a certain city, usually they're all gathered up, or many of them are gathered up, they're imprisoned, and these kind of salacious charges are placed against them about all things they've done as a result of their religion. None of these cases were ever proved, but 1840 is the most important case for European history, because what happens is it begins to open up an avenue for international Jewish communication that is connected to communication with kings, politicians, and other government leaders. The likes of Moses Montefiore and Adolf Cremot made numerous trips to the region and sought to overturn this conviction. But these leading Jews with whom Hyde would meet, right, and Woodruff right, says in his journal, we know about these guys, right? He knows about what Montefiore is up to. He says, those leading Jews who were petitioning Damascus officials, the Catholic Church, the Ottoman officials, and the world leaders to put a stop to the accusations. Here you have Father Thomas and his servant. And you can see that in order to understand why Hyde cares so much about this, we have to place him in this context, right? You've got a ritual murder charge in which international Jewish communities are coming to the aid of a particular community in Damascus in 1841. We've got the popular press. As you can see here, the Jewish Chronicle starts publishing in 1841 as a result of Montefiore and Cremot and others who say we need an organ by which we can communicate what's happening in the Jewish world to people around us. So what they do is they create the Jewish Chronicle, which is one of the most important papers. It still continues today, but during the 19th century it was read by Jews in Russia, it was read by Jews in France, England, the United States. And what it does is it goes through, in addition to advertising cod liver oil, it advertises things like, here's what's happening in Russia this week. And they talk about the anti-Semitic claims that are being made against Jews, or they talk about new legislation, or they talk about kind of significant cultural achievements. And so the Jewish Chronicle as a newspaper becomes a vehicle by which Jews can communicate to the broader world. I have a hard time imagining that some of these early apostles aren't encountering people who are contributing to the Jewish Chronicle if they're not reading it themselves. They seem to be fairly aware of what's happening among these early British Jews. Now, If we stop for a minute and think about what they're really seeing. So here's what Woodruff says. He says, "But in the midst of this mighty struggle, there is a small portion of the community among the nations of the earth who are looking upon a day big with events, even the restoration of primitive Christianity, the proclamation of the fullness of the everlasting gospel among the nations, both Gentile and Jew, the restoration of the Jews to their own land, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, great changes, judgments, wars, and revolutions, and of the Gentile nations, the second advent of the Messiah in the clouds of heaven, and the great millennium, or rest of the saints of 1,000 years, all of which events have been predicted by the holy prophets who have spoken since the world began." So in the mind of Woodruff, as he's sitting there in Liverpool, he's writing this down. He's making a record of where he sees the world in 1840 and 1841, right? Of course, we have the restoration of primitive Christianity, which, as he understands it, this is Mormonism, right? He sees the unfolding events of wars, revolutions, and other events going on as connected to the return of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the gathering of Israel, and the millennial reign of Christ. We have to understand that their theology, their politics, and their activism are all connected. You can't divorce those out as separate things. Sometimes it's very easy for us to say, well, Joseph has a revelation that this is what should happen, so that's why they do it. What I want to do here is just kind of show how it's a little bit more complicated than that. Orson Hyde is intrigued by Jews because he's been studying Hebrew and things like that, but also because he's meeting with these people and he's hearing what they're saying. And he's hearing their plight, right? 1840, 1839. These are critical years for Jews in Europe. And so he's hearing this and he's writing back to Joseph and he's echoing the political notion of gathering rather than a future spiritual date in which this will happen. So as we think about this, I want to kind of place it back in the context of the restoration, right? As we celebrate the 175th anniversary of Hyde going to Jerusalem and dedicating the land, not for missionary work, but for the regathering of Jews, of Israel, it's significant that we stop and say, why did it matter so much? For these early Mormons, it mattered in part because they were seeing themselves as God's agents in the world who could bring this about, right? It's not insignificant that in 1838, as these apostles are hearing they need to go back to Britain, 1839, 40, 41, as they're hearing this, they're knowing what they're getting into. They've already been there, some of them. And so they're going to be called to go back and work among the people there and bring about important church leaders and important converts who will eventually make their way, of course, to Utah, many of them. But as we look back, there's a parallel gathering going on. And the saints understood this. It's reflected in the journals of the apostles. It's reflected in Hyde's ambition to go to Jerusalem. Right? This is not a good place to go in 1840. It's not pleasant. Those early settlements of Jewish gatherings that they tried to create there in Jerusalem failed miserably due to disease, due to poverty, etc. Many of these early communities packed up and went home. So he's traveling to a place that is, of course, very, very fun and you know, in the mind of Hyde, right? This is a place where you want to go because this is where Jesus was, right? The reality is when you show up there in 1840, it's a fairly miserable place. But he's willing to take that on, and this becomes for Hyde his contribution to the gathering of Israel.